Welcome to the Responsible Bytes podcast, everyone, the podcast where we talk about all things safe and responsible technology. I'm your host, Dr. Zena Assaad, and today I'm joined by Eryk Salvaggio, who's a Gates Scholar for a PhD in Digital Humanities at Cambridge University and an affiliated researcher with Machine Visual Culture Research Group at the Max Planck Institute. Welcome to the podcast, Eryk.
Thanks for having me.
It's really great to have you on the podcast. Now, I asked you to be on the podcast today because you wrote a brilliant article for Tech Policy Press. I know you're a proliferated writer for them, really, but you wrote a recent one about the UN Scientific Panel, and it's titled How the UN Scientific Panel Erases Human Responsibility for AI. And I will leave a link to the article in the description. But I wanted to talk to you in this episode about this article. Specifically, there's this line that you have in the article. You refer to AI as systems from nowhere. Can you unpack that for me a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So the system from nowhere is a way of talking about AI systems that excludes its origin as a consciously human-designed product. In other words, it treats AI almost as if it were a spontaneously emerging force of nature. So the system from nowhere has to do with where you locate the system's boundary when you're analyzing it, looking at it, talking about it. And it's a bit of a rhetorical magic trick because you can make AI companies disappear. You just kind of talk about the system instead of the decisions that created the system. So there was a recent example that I know we mentioned when we were emailing about this OpenAI Hugging Face hack, right?
Yes, it's been all over my social media feed.
Yeah. And if you look at the coverage, there's something that's really interesting, right? So I have three headlines that I pulled for this conversation, and I'll read them and we could think about them for a second. Oh, basically, OpenAI had this model that was still in development. It's not public, and it hacked another AI company called Hugging Face. And the headlines go like this. New York Times, OpenAI says its models went rogue and attacked a digital library. Wired magazine, OpenAI models escaped containment and hacked Hugging Face. And Washington Post went with OpenAI's models went rogue and hacked another company. So we can look at these headlines and we could think about them a little bit. A couple things are happening here, and all of them relate to this system from nowhere. First, if you say an AI model went rogue, you're skipping the part where OpenAI manually removed its cybersecurity blocks from the model it was testing, which was an experimental model. They didn't know, they had no idea how it was going to behave, right? So you skip that part. You skip the part that OpenAI chose to run tests on a machine that was connected to the internet, had a live network connection. They had kind of firewalled it, right, to be oversimplify it, but this was a model designed to find exploits, and it found an exploit, and they were surprised by this, right? So if you look at AI as a system from nowhere, you can make the claim that the model went rogue because you're only looking at the model and what it is doing. And you could talk about it breaking containments, but both of them are placing a kind of agency and decision-making onto the model rather than looking at the people who set the stage for that behavior.
You know, what's interesting to me when I was reading all of these headlines, I kept rolling my eyes, right? I was like, oh my gosh. But then a friend of mine who doesn't work in this industry DM'd me one of the articles and was like, oh my God. And it made me realize, when you're not kind of in this sphere and working on this, quite regularly like you and I do, you read a headline like this and it's plausible to you. It's plausible for you to believe that these are the kinds of systems that could, quote unquote, go rogue and escape their sandboxes or however it is that they describe it. But it's exactly as you said, these systems are designed to do exactly what they do. So when this AI system hacked, whatever it was, that's because it's designed to do, it's a design feature within the system. They're designed to find vulnerabilities and to exploit them. But what's interesting to me and something I want to unpack with you a little bit more is the why. Why is this narrative of systems from nowhere beneficial for companies like OpenAI?
Right. Yeah. And I want to be clear too. This takes nothing away from the fact that LLMs are writing code, right? And they're finding exploits. I think that's very clear. And there's a very clear explanation for how this is happening and why this is happening that gets lost a little bit behind this intelligence myth. The system from nowhere does this interesting trick, and that it's a really flawed way of understanding what the models are doing that relates to the story of intelligence, right? And everything the model does, you can kind of translate back if the story you've got for the entire thing is that it's an intelligent system. And yet, when we talk about this, and the reason that I think this is so appealing to these tech companies in particular is that it really takes away attention from questions about, as you pointed out, what it was built to do and how it was built to do that. In other words, how it became what it is. And instead, it centers the model's capabilities as if it came from nowhere. So the sense that it acts or learns or decides on its own has this kind of added benefit of making everyone, even its critics, talk about what these models do and are capable of, even when they do terrible things. It becomes a kind of buzz marketing. And so a lot of people kind of cynically, and not that you shouldn't be cynical, it's totally okay to be cynical of tech companies, but kind of cynically assume that maybe OpenAI had staged this instance. But I think that if you look at the way that these companies operate, it's really more a matter of spin. It's a way of turning this around, right, into a favorable story. They've got this myth that they have where everything connects back to, does this prove that the model is getting intelligent? Does this prove that the model is getting smarter? Which, those are things that the model possess, right? Intelligence is something the model has. And that means that they're not thinking about, should we build this differently? Should we design this differently? Or at least they're moving the conversation away from those questions. It's kind of a way of like obscuring bad security hygiene by twisting it into a marketing opportunity.
Well, when you were saying that, I actually made a note on my notebook and I wrote a manufactured accountability gap. So this idea of these systems from nowhere, as you said, kind of creates a veneer between the system and the people actually developing the system, and it kind of manufactures basically an accountability gap. So in addition to the intelligence myth, which I entirely agree with you, it's a way of, positioning these systems as being far more sophisticated than they actually are. The other thing it does is it creates a separation between those developing it and the system itself. So when the system goes rogue, I hate that language so much, but
Yeah.
when the system, goes rogue or does something that or they claim that it's not supposed to do, there's this degree of separation between them and the system, and it creates a manufactured accountability gap.
Yes. And I would argue that this accountability gap is present in so many of the ways that we think about artificial intelligence. Yeah. And a lot of this is that artificial intelligence is kind of a displacement of people in general. It is kind of asking you to displace your own accountability when you use it, because we could say, well, the AI did that stuff, right? There's a really interesting article that I read the other day that was about this. We constantly see this prefix of right? Co-pilot, and co-authorship with AI systems, which does this cool, or maybe cool isn't the right word, but it does this kind of strange trick where it elevates the system to your level, but then you're also apparently the one who's accountable for what the system does. And I think that's appropriate, right? Human in the loop means that there is someone there to be accountable for it. But we are also talking about so-called agentic systems where getting into what it does is literally impossible in some cases. The most recent models don't allow you to even see some of what it's doing behind the scenes. But you're asking it literally to make decisions on your behalf that are complicated, and you're having now these various sort of models intervene. So you're displacing the design choices on the one hand and saying it's the AI. You're also kind of displacing the user in a way by saying, let the AI do it for you, but also you take the blame if it goes quote unquote rogue. And then you're also displacing people who are experiencing the consequences of these systems. So all of this basically by saying, well, we're not going to look at people. We're not going to look at the humans behind the system. Instead, we're going to look at the system, and we're not going to ask any questions around where that system came from. That's the system from nowhere.
And this came out, or I read it first in your article, which specifically references the UN scientific panel report that was released recently. And one of the things I talk about a lot in my work is that these narratives are really important because they end up being reflected in broader multilateral policies and initiatives that come about around AI. And I feel the UN scientific panel is a fantastic example of that because even the report itself is emblematic of these systems from nowhere. So can you draw that out a little bit for me of how you kind of reflected on that when you were reading the UN scientific panel's report?
Yeah. So to set some context, the UN report, what we're calling the UN report, it's shorthand for, what is it? The UN's preliminary report of the Independent International Scientific Panel on AI, or
Which is why we're
IIS.
just calling it the UN report.
Right. If I said that twice, we'd be out of time. So we'll just acknowledge it's an independent report, right? The context is it was an independent report that the UN basically commissioned, and then this independent group of 40 experts submitted this report. And
Which
it's
I just want
40,
to clarify
yeah,
included technical experts. That's a really
included
important point.
technical experts. Also included, it was co-chaired Yoshia Bengio, who has some existential risk connections, right? And
Yeah.
then you also have Maria Ressa, who's a Filipino and American journalist and Nobel Prize laureate, who faced lots of consequences for her reporting and is very dedicated to the misinformation and this kind of abuse of these systems. So there's expertise there, but there's also real points of view there. And so you have these 40 experts, technical experts, but also a kind of existential risk, AI
Hmm.
safety, critical AI melange that's kind of has to grapple with what's going to come out of this report and what this definition is going to be, right? And what is the report itself? The report itself is supposed to serve as a shared resource for the UN member states. So you have a lot of countries that do not have independent AI research capacity, including on the impacts or effects of AI. And so this was supposed to be a kind of common reference, right? So it's an important document. And
Hmm.
the issue is that the document starts out with a definition of AI that is entirely dependent on this system from nowhere frame. So this is the definition of AI that they are going with has no human beings in it at all. And then you could say, well, okay, what's a definition? But it's actually really important because it sets the frame for all of the recommendations in the report and the way that all of the problems and even the opportunities are sort of positioned to the UN and to the UN's member states. So we can look at the definition. I have it here. So it defines AI as machine systems that, broadly speaking, perceive, learn, and act. They infer from inputs how to generate outputs, such as predictions, contents, recommendations, actions, or decisions, with varying degrees of autonomy and adaptiveness. And then they write, what unifies current AI more than any single architecture is that modern systems learn from experience represented by data. So we can unpack that a little bit, right? What I noticed first, as mentioned, there's no human beings in this definition at all. And this follows a move over a couple of important policy documents from major institutions like the OECD. The OECD's initial sort of definition of AI had human designers, right? Decisions. This kind of stuff was there. The EU AI Act kind of took away a little bit of that. And now the UN has taken away all the last sort of remnants of the human fingerprints on these systems. And so what we get instead of people is language that says the machine is doing what people do. So you might have heard them in that definition, right? Perceives,
Hmm.
learns,
Yeah, I
acts,
cringed when you said the word perceived. I was like, oh.
right? And experience, right? That's another one. What is it? Experience. What is this model experiencing, right? So what definitions of those words are the UN using? Who talks like that? Right? These are oftentimes in industry understood to refer to certain technical aspects of the system or certain types of behaviors that are in the system, but it is still a kind of allegorical shorthand, right? And they're all telling not just this system from nowhere, meaning that the people aren't there, but it's also the intelligence story, right? They're not
Mhm.
aiming for technical precision. They're aiming for this is an intelligent system that perceives, learns, acts, has experiences, and that's what we need to regulate. That's what we need to know in order to think about policy, in order to think about opportunities, risks, and regulation. But it's really that accountability gap that you were talking about before is there because the people are gone. And instead, the machine is being ascribed with what humans would have brought to that system. It's all inside this definition of what AI even is. Um, and this inference of inputs to generate outputs is system from nowhere descriptions of the training process, right? So there's a technical thing there, and the
Mhm.
machine is inferring, but there's no explanation of what it's inferring or how. So again, the people are being removed from the system because, well, what is that data? Where is that data coming from?
I had a quick reflection when you were
Yeah.
saying this stuff. I made a note of something.
Hmm.
So, there's a lot in this definition around learning, around experience. And one of the narratives that often accompanies AI is that it learns as it goes. So it learns from experience.
Hmm.
And a reflection I made is I wonder if this narrative is there for many reasons. But one of the reasons potentially is that it's an excuse for crappy tech, right?
Hmm.
Like if these systems produce garbage outputs, it's like, oh well, it hasn't had the experience that it needs yet. It's still learning, right?
Yes.
And it gives
Yes.
you a kind of a similar narrative that you would for a person. Like if you have a junior intern that comes in, of course they're going to make a lot of mistakes. They're still learning. They don't have
Hmm.
experience. And I wonder as well, in line with, these systems from nowhere and kind of individualizing these systems and really anthropomorphizing them in a
Hmm.
way, I wonder if this language is also quite strategic. I wouldn't say that the UN scientific panel have specifically used this language for that reason. No, I think they've used this language because they've built on from public narratives on this technology which use this language. But
Hmm.
nonetheless, I think the point still stands that it kind of does create a scapegoat for crappy technical systems.
It's a scapegoat for bad systems that is conveniently implies that you just need more information, more access to data.
It's
Um,
not that the system is bad, it's that it just doesn't have enough data.
right. And that leads to arguments, especially if you're in a kind of national security framework, right? That, oh, if we let these pesky copyright laws get in the way of the training data,
Hmm.
then these other countries are going to develop AI faster than we are. Which is really funny when you think about that argument being applied to image models. Like China's going to make cooler AI art than us, and so we're going to lose the AI war. So therefore, we cannot afford to give artists the rights that they have always had. So these types of things, they open up sort of a set of arguments, but also this idea of learning positions the model to sort of say, well, why can't it read all the text the way a person can when they go to the library, right? And well, libraries pay for those books, right? Like that's one of the big objections to the way that these models are being trained. And it is interesting because we can link this to the report. The text in the report, actually, when they talk about this cultural traces, which is how they describe this data that these machines are being learning from, or whatever. These cultural traces, they don't really talk about where these cultural traces come from, even though artists have been complaining about their rights being infringed, right? You have a bunch of publishers saying, we don't want you training on our models, and you did anyway, and you can get a full paywall New York Times article out of OpenAI at one point, right? So all of this is kind of slips to the side when you say, well, the model learns. Um, and curiously, when the UN report talks about this, copyright laws and intellectual property, they only talk about it as a limit on global AI growth. Like they talk about it as an obstacle to the opportunities of AI, which the report is also supposed to highlight.
That was something that really disappointed me in the report, and I guess there's a conversation here around what is the role of the UN in this multilateral discussion. You know, the UN's come forward with this scientific panel. What was their role when delivering this report? Was their role to be impartial? Although I know in your article you talk about how impartiality or neutrality actually isn't real, and I want you to unpack that in a sec. Or is their role to actually put forward or highlight some of the limitations that come with these kinds of systems, right? Because you're absolutely right. I remember reading the report and reading these notes on copyright, and they did frame them as an obstacle, or, they didn't say these words, but it was reminiscent to me of some of the US narratives of bureaucratic red tape.
Mm,
And so I found that really interesting. But I want to touch on this point of impartiality or neutrality never actually being neutral. You talk about that in the article. Can you tell
mhm.
me a little bit about that and why you feel like the UN report, number one, is not neutral and should not be neutral?
Well, I think it can't be. They were set up to be kind of apolitical, which is a red flag because the minute you think you're not being political is the moment where you are most deeply engaging in politics, quite often, right? And
I'm a firm believer that doing nothing is doing something.
doing nothing is doing something, and defining objectivity is a political operation, right?
Yeah.
And this system from nowhere it speaks to some of this too, right? It comes from Thomas Nagel, right? The view from nowhere. He sort of advocated that we could transcend a particular viewpoint and see the world more rationally and objectively. But there's been real pushback on this idea, particularly in journalism, right? So the view from nowhere is also used by this media scholar Jay Rosen to talk about this false objectivity of the press, right? That if you're talking about something and you are invested in it, or if you are speaking about it as if it has consequences, or even acknowledging the politics of it, then in some way you're actually biased, right? And you see this with climate change, for example, right? If you
Yeah.
say the world's getting warmer and things are burning down more often, you also have to say, but also this fossil fuel burning company put out a report that says it's cows, and that is how you are objective, right? But that isn't objective. That's just sort of both sidesing, and it has all these problems of like equal weight and measuring that, which is a series of political decisions that you are making. And so Jay Rosen basically says, like, listen, media cannot be objective. What we need to do is define our biases, right? And there's another element to this too, which is the Donna Haraway piece, right? Which is the view from nowhere. And basically the way that Donna Haraway talks about it is objective vision is always going to be partial vision, right? If you're going to be objective, you are choosing to see a kind of abstract thing and you're cutting away the parts that complicate it. And she says that objectivity is unlocatable, right? And I think that this is what's going on here, is that they're saying the AI, right? The UN is saying the AI is kind of unlocatable. Therefore, we are being objective by describing it that way. We're not pointing fingers. We're being apolitical, right? Because we're being neutral by saying that, by focusing only on the system as if it came from nowhere. But the minute we started pointing out where accountability might be found, we would veer into politics, and that would be messy, and that would be outside of our mandate. But you cannot talk about a system without talking about the people who build it. And you cannot, future-proof this system by talking about some imaginary thing that writes its own code, right? You're perpetuating a kind of hype around the direction of these models when you do that. So there's this objectivity piece, this apolitical piece that I think is ultimately flawed, and it cannot be done. And a real accounting of the risks and the benefits of artificial intelligence, which is a very vague term, just to throw that in there. I don't think it can be done if you're focusing on neutrality and objectivity, especially if your version of objectivity is saying we can't point fingers at accountability or at anyone who's suffering consequences. I think that's a real constraint on what this report ever could have achieved.
I agree. And I was so disappointed that from my perspective, I didn't feel that the report had a point of view. What is
Yes.
the purpose of this report? Where does it sit in the broader discourse on this particular topic. And so it made me ask the question, which I'm now going to ask you because I don't have an answer for myself, but where does this report sit in the context of broader discourse on this topic? But specifically, I want to understand, where does this report sit in the context of industry and their direction?
Yeah. So a lot of this text is coming, basically it is reflecting what I would identify as a myth that is, we touched a little bit on this before, right? This intelligence myth
Hmm.
is, it's a story. It is a myth in this like real sense of the story that makes sense of the world and makes sense of the technologies that's being built. And I do think that it is a real belief among this industry. I think we could say that it is cynical, right? And oftentimes it will be used that way. The communications department may not sincerely believe it, but the CEO might. And so the UN language is reflecting that belief system. And I think that's the real giveaway. That's the real sort of clue that's in this text that says, actually, it's not unbiased. It's not objective. It is coming from a point of view and it's pretending otherwise. An example of this point of view that I could talk about is there's another petition. One of the amazing phenomenons of this whole AI period is that there's industry every 6 months gets together and they write a document that says somebody needs to stop us. And there was a recent one that said basically it was only CEOs and only developers from AI companies. Developers or engineers or researchers, whatever you want to call them. The signatories were all people who worked in building this technology. And I was struck because one of the comments, I have it, the debate inside the companies is if AI will be advancing itself past our control in 2 years or 4. So take note of that phrasing, right? Advancing itself. Being
This is
written,
coming from developers, engineers.
literally the people inside the companies
Yeah,
building the thing. And so
right.
you could say, well, they want us to think the system is a system from nowhere, but it's actually an argument of incredible passivity on their behalf, right? To take this seriously, you would have to believe that the entire industry is somehow captive to some absurd scenario of mind control. The claim amounts to basically, I cannot stop myself from gathering data, cleaning it, pre-training models, calibrating the results of that pre-training to goals that I myself am setting, and optimizing these systems to achieve, right? I have no say over any of that stuff. Something is just pulling me to do that, right? There's a lure. I'm doing all of that, but nothing can intervene. Nothing can stop me. I'm an addict. I'm enthralled to something greater than myself, and we are begging someone to stop us. That's the story that we are supposed to believe. And to make sense of that, I think it's devastating that there is something that has taken control of the thinking inside the industry. And this idea of intelligence, right? Which is the wrong word, as we discussed, for many reasons. But it operates as a kind of ideological position, right? This losing control narrative actually creates the loss of control. Nobody's losing control of an emerging intelligence, right? They're redirecting their own agency and their own decisions to the thing that they are building. And then by giving away that control, they're convincing themselves that it is in control, right? So you're building a thing that can code. And then you're saying, now that it can write a little bit of code, I'm going to have it write more code for me. And then I'm going to trust that code. And now that I can trust that code being built, I can build a larger scaffolding where there's now 2 agents building competing sets of code and balancing them against each other or whatever. So you're essentially displacing yourself. And this is, I think, what's happening inside the industry because everything is being made sense of through this thing that says we are building an intelligence. And any behavior that it displays is proof of that intelligence. It's unfalsifiable. Nothing can say it isn't a result of intelligence, except for the fact that they are building the mechanisms themselves, right? So if you look at the mechanisms, you can identify it. But there's all this kind of, well, it's intelligent, it's smart, it's learning. All of this stuff is a belief inside the industry that I think is coming out. And when you see the UN mirror and mimic that kind of language, what you're seeing is an alignment of the UN, whether it knows it or not, with the industry's internal story that it is telling, which is a myth, right? A myth is a way that you make sense of the complexity of the world, right? Through a simple reference, a simple story, a simplified story, anyway. And a myth that does this work is also a kind of ideological position. It's a political position.
The pessimist in me is about to come out, Eryk, so prepare yourself.
Oh no.
Is this so? I don't disagree with anything you said, but I wonder if yeah, because I've seen the petitions. They come out, like you said, every 6 months. Oh no, please stop us. We can't stop ourselves. None of these people have actually quit their jobs. They all still work
Mm,
within these industries. This is the wild part, right? Of like, it's an existential crisis. We need everybody to sign this petition to stop us. I'm not going to quit my job, but please sign this petition to stop us. So the pessimist in me wonders if all of this is part of the broader marketing scheme, right? Because the articles that came out about these OpenAI systems, quote unquote, going rogue, that was a marketing agenda.
mm,
It is beneficial to OpenAI to have publications referencing their models and their systems as going rogue and breaking out of their sandboxes because it creates a perception of systems far more sophisticated than they actually are. And so hearing everything you're saying, like, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but there's this little, like, the little pessimist on my shoulder who's also like, I wonder if this is part of that internal race to get ahead of the narrative and be like, we're losing track of the narrative. People are starting to realize that these systems aren't great anymore. I know what we're going to do. We're going to come up with another petition. And so
mm.
I wonder if there's an element of that as well.
I think that there's multiple sort of ways of making sense within the industry of what these things are, right? There is, I think, sincere, legitimate concern that is rooted in like game theory, right? That we have to build it.
Hmm.
We will be responsible because if we don't, someone else will, whether it's another company, another country, so on, right? So there is this, and I think that is a sincere belief amongst some. There is also a kind of strategic belief, right? That comes up, right? Where you can leverage this actual belief or you can lean on this belief. And there are some political operators within industry. Some is probably undercutting it. There are many, and they have lobbyists. They have highly paid, I assume, highly paid PR operations. And this might get associated with that, and you could tell in a sense like what the concerns of the industry are at any given moment. If they're worried about the competition, right, which right now they are, right, these open models coming out of China are sort of meeting the capabilities of the US commercial model manufacturers, I'm not sure is the right word. And so as a result of this, they're basically saying we need more regulation, right? Which means we need you to ban these Chinese open source models, right? So they
Hmm.
can lean into that when it's convenient. Um, and so that the other thing is that it does reaffirm sort of this shared, oh my God, like AI is coming, and we can't stop it. What's going to happen if we can't stop it? And those are the bad guys. Those are bad guys. Regulate. We need regulation. We will follow that regulation and so on. And it's really interesting that OpenAI, of all companies, which is a company sort of founded on this idea that like we are the ones who can safely shepherd this. We're a nonprofit. We're the good guys. We are responsible. We know how to handle these things, are exactly the ones who were basically incompetent, right? And this model was a security breach, akin to something like a lab leak, right? They
Hmm.
didn't secure it, and then the thing went online. Nothing that it did is particularly shocking. Outside of that, not that it isn't an achievement. It is an achievement. I do think these things are capable of finding exploits. They are engineered to do so, and these companies know that, which is why it's so very odd to have them on a machine with a live internet connection, with a sort of flimsy third-party firewall equivalent that, and then saying, well, oh my God, it'll never get out of this. But like you built it to get out of this. You're testing it. You're asking it, can you get out of this? And then you're acting surprised when it does. So this is, it's all, I think, multi-layered. um, between PR, genuine belief, and ideology, right? This organizing story. Everything that it does, if it is capable of finding exploits, that's proof of its intelligence. If it solves these new math problems, that's proof that it is getting smarter, rather than focusing on the individual bits and pieces that are being built by the engineers. They're addressing it as one complete thing, as if AI is this entity where it can do math and it can do exploits and it can make images, but all of these are like separate components or separate sort of sets of optimizations, and they're not pointing to a holistic general intelligence, which is what they're aiming for, right? This AGI story of a machine that is as smart as a human being. That's the goal that they're all trying to reach, because that's the goal that was set up back in the Dartmouth conferences. So this is, it's an ideology, and it is cynically deployed, but it is also, I think, there are true believers in the industry.
I agree with you that it is an ideology, but there are absolutely not just true believers in the industry, but true believers in the general public as
Yeah.
well. And that for me is the most concerning part. And it's
Yes.
why public education on these technologies and what they are and are not capable of is so fundamentally important. Because when you have this kind of ideology that seeps into the general public, it really shapes the way people respond to this kind of technology and how receptive they are to it. And so that for me is more concerning than the internal ideology within the industry.
Yes, but it gets out, right? And it leaks in a
Hmm.
way. That ideology, particularly, what's really interesting to me is you see politicians, policymakers, NGOs like the philanthropic organizations. You see the
Hmm.
UN. You see all of these things that are sort of saying, well, we need to talk to the CEOs of these tech companies because they're the ones who know and understand how the models are being built. And yet, basically, like literally they're saying, like, we don't have any understanding. That is a refrain, right? We don't know how these models work. We don't know what they do. We're losing control of them. And yet we're going to these people to say, what's happening with AI? And so they are literally saying, like, don't ask us. We don't know. But we're asking them anyway. Journalists go to them and rely on them to define the technology, to make sense of the technology. These reporters are then reporting that frame and that story to the general public. Policymakers are going to these CEOs and tech companies and saying, tell us about your model. They're getting a story that is seeped in this intelligence ideology, right? The shorthand, the allegories, the metaphors, it's learning, it's creative, and so forth. And so that's the easy way in. They're trying to make an easy path for people to understand and relate to these systems, but they're also doing it in a way that leads to a specific set of priorities and a specific way of handling them. So we see it in this question of, well, what happens when the model becomes self-aware? What happens when the model goes rogue? What happens when the model takes control of itself? Those are concerns that should be very low on the list, but incredibly, they're extraordinarily high, right? And
Hmm.
they are superventing real concerns about real things that are happening to real people right now. And so I think this is it behooves journalists to start telling stories that challenge that narrative. And it also, I think, is important for policymakers to understand that they're being told a story. They're being looped into a belief system that they can resist and they can challenge and they can engage with critically, even if it is a kind of very wealthy CEO that allegedly knows how these systems work. Um, and they're saying, we don't know. We don't understand how these models work, and we can't control them. So maybe let's stop asking those people how they work and how we control them.
I read this article that was released in the ABC here in Australia on this, whole OpenAI hacking saga. And it can be used the Terminator as a point of comparison.
Yes.
And I wrote this ranty blue sky thread about it because I was like, I was so mad about it. I was like, why are you not fact checking? I literally put this in my thread. I was like, why are you not fact checking? I was like, here are some facts about this. But I remember reading this article that even had like pictures of like that robot in the Terminator, you know, the like the bad one that comes out to try to kill Arnold Schwarzenegger or the kid, or I don't know. You can tell how long it's been since I've seen this film, but nonetheless. And they even had a photo of Sarah Connor, and it was like it's had its Sarah Connor moment, blah, blah. And I was like, what is
Right,
this
right.
rubbish? How are you legitimately writing about this? I couldn't believe it. I was very angry about it, Eryk. I was like, I went to Blue Sky to like rant my frustrations about this article.
Yeah, I mean, the Terminator is like the go-to. That's the big
Oh,
fear. The Skynet, all of this stuff, and yeah, it is just a bit silly. But it's also really telling how reliant they are on science fiction, right? To make
mhm.
this story make sense. And again, it's
It's
not
a
that
point of
these models,
reference.
yeah, it's a point of common reference, right? When you design a technology, your entire goal, you're basically creating a piece of science fiction that exists in the world, and you have to help people make sense of it. And sometimes those shorthands are helpful, right? Sometimes, I don't think the Terminator is a helpful shorthand for Alexa, right?
Neither
But
do I, but
but this is what designers are doing. They're trying to develop these technologies in ways that tell stories, and that story is embedded into the way that the public is making sense of them. And so even the chatbot frame, right? It is inviting you to say, there's a little guy on the other side. You're typing text and it is responding to you. It used to have that spinning wheel it still does, right? Thinking. Um, Reasoning is another thing where it's not reasoning, it's generating longer and longer sentences out of the sentences you've given it, and then it's trying to like compress and summarize
using
that back down.
probabilistic methods, it's
Yes,
mathematics, not so like,
right.
it's not magic.
Yes, yeah, and that's the thing. It's not magic. It's not unexplainable, and engineers know this. So I don't understand why they think it cannot be stopped.
So then on the point of the general public, we've now come to the end of our episode, as much as I honestly could have talked to you for hours, Eryk. But the last question that I'm going to ask you is the question I ask all of my guests. And it is, what is one piece of advice that you have for people for engaging with technology safely and responsibly? So what is your one responsible bite?
I think that we should be leaning into producing our own friction. Technologies are designed to be frictionless. And when you have a frictionless technology, you are basically taking yourself out of the system. And so if you have one of these agentic systems and you're telling it, write this code for me, and it's writing you a bunch of code, and it's writing, let's say it writes great code, you have handed off the series of decisions about how that code arrives in the world. And when you do that, you are losing control. You are giving your control away. And so if we embrace and find opportunities for friction, I think that we actually slow things down. We reflect more on the decisions that are being made. We have time to think about why we are making the decisions, what the goals of the thing that we are doing is, and why we are doing them at all. And so I think this is really what I'm looking at, where all of this technology right now is designed to be easy, frictionless, take away the annoying aspects of your life. And nobody likes annoyances. But sometimes those little stopping points where you have to stop and reassess are really critical. And so that's where I land. To be more responsible, think about the friction that you can produce for yourself and when you want to embrace friction in these types of uses of technology.
That's wonderful advice, Eryk. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Like I said, I honestly could have talked to you for hours. For all of our listeners, I know that Eryk made reference to lots of different people and articles, and I will make a full list of them in the description available for everyone. But thank you again, Eryk.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.